They told you sugar was the enemy. But the real killer, it's salt. In fact, over 75% of the sodium Americans consume comes from processed and packaged foods, not the salt shaker on your dinner table. According to the CDC, nearly 1 in every 3 Americans over 60 has high blood pressure directly linked to excess sodium intake. The scariest part, most of them have no idea it's happening. I want you to imagine this. You're enjoying a warm bowl of soup, something you've eaten your whole life. And then, minutes later, you're on the floor, unable to speak. One side of your body paralyzed. Sounds impossible. That's exactly what happened to one of my patients. George, a 68-year-old retired school teacher from Columbus, Ohio. Before we dive into his story, I want you to do 3 things first. Drop a comment if you or someone in your family has ever relied on canned or frozen food out of convenience. Second, hit that subscribe button if you care about your health and want to keep your brain and heart strong after 60. And third, listen carefully, because the next few minutes could save your life or someone you love. Let me quickly introduce myself. I'm Dr. Mark Hyman, MD, a practicing functional medicine physician with over 30 years of experience helping thousands of men reclaim their health. I've worked with everyone from everyday retirees to elite athletes and top CEOs, and I've seen firsthand how small dietary choices like that innocent-looking can of soup can destroy your life if you're not paying attention. Today, I'm going to walk you through the chilling true story of what happened to George. But more importantly, I'll help you understand the hidden dangers of everyday foods and what you need to avoid starting today, because what you don't know can hurt you. George never saw it coming. That morning in Columbus felt like any other. His wife, Linda, had just come back from the grocery store and picked up a few canned soups, something quick, easy, and warm for the chilly fall weather. George, a retired teacher who had always been in decent shape, popped the lid, heated it up, and sat down at the table. Chicken noodle, his favorite. Within 10 minutes, Linda heard the crash. She ran into the kitchen to find George slumped over, his right arm hanging limp, his face twisted, and his speech completely garbled. She dialed 911 with shaking hands. The paramedics arrived fast. George was conscious, but barely. The right side of his body was paralyzed, and he couldn't form complete sentences. At the hospital, scans confirmed it, a massive ischemic stroke. Blood flow to his brain had been blocked, likely by a clot. But why? George didn't smoke. He wasn't obese. His cholesterol was a bit high. Sure, but nothing out of the ordinary for a 68-year-old. No prior history of stroke, no falls, no injuries. So, the doctor asked the one question that changed everything. What did you eat this morning? Linda mentioned the soup. The doctor raised an eyebrow and pulled out his phone. A quick Google search showed the can George had eaten contained 380 mg of sodium per serving. He had 2 servings, almost 2 800 mg of sodium in one sitting. That's more than the recommended daily limit for an adult in the US in just one meal. And here's what many people forget. Sodium doesn't just raise blood pressure slowly over time. In sensitive individuals, especially older men, it can cause a sudden spike in blood pressure, leading to a rupture or a clot. George, it turns out, was one of those people. The worst part, this could have been avoided. A simple look at the label, a small change in habit. But like most Americans, George never checked the sodium content. He trusted the shelves. He assumed if it's in the supermarket, it must be safe. But that morning, a can of soup almost killed him. George regained consciousness in the ICU hours later, but nothing felt the same. His thoughts were cloudy, his mouth dry, and when he tried to speak, the words came out jumbled and slow. He looked at Linda, standing at his bedside, eyes red from crying. "What happened?" he slurred. "You had a stroke." "George," she whispered, gripping his hand. He didn't remember the soup. He didn't remember the ambulance ride. All he remembered was warmth, and then darkness. Over the next few days, the neurologist explained what had happened in simple terms. The massive influx of sodium had likely spiked George's blood pressure so quickly that a blood clot formed and blocked a major artery leading to his brain. In men over 60, the elasticity of arteries weakens. Add decades of salty foods, and the risk skyrockets. But here's what shocked George the most. This wasn't a freak accident. It was a pattern. Thousands of seniors across the U.S. suffer strokes every year, triggered not by stress or genetics, but by what's in their pantry. According to the American Heart Association, over 70% of adults over 60 consume more than the recommended sodium daily. Most of them don't realize it. They trust the brands they've known for years. George was no different. He thought he was doing fine eating soup, sandwiches, frozen meals here and there. He stayed active, played with his grandkids, went on walks. He didn't feel unhealthy, but sodium damage doesn't send warning signals. It builds up silently, stiffening blood vessels, raising blood pressure inch by inch. And then, one day, boom, a stroke, a heart attack, or worse. For George, the hardest part wasn't the pain. It was the frustration of knowing it could have been prevented. "If I'd just paid attention," he said, "maybe I wouldn't be here in this bed." The hospital's stroke rehab center became George's new home for the next several weeks. Every day, he relearned basic tasks: how to hold a spoon, how to sit up, how to take a step without falling. Once a man who built science fair projects with students, he now struggled to open a juice carton. And through it all, Linda was by his side, watching her husband slowly try to piece himself back together. Recovery wasn't just physical, it was emotional, spiritual, and deeply humbling. George had always been the strong one, the rock, the guy who fixed leaky faucets, carried heavy groceries, and gave long-winded speeches at family barbecues. Now, he needed help to use the restroom. That realization hit him harder than the stroke itself. Each day at the rehab center brought a mix of progress and pain. Physical therapy sessions left him drenched in sweat, his muscles trembling from simple movements. Occupational therapy taught him how to grip a toothbrush again, how to button a shirt. Some days he improved, other days he couldn't lift his leg off the bed. Frustration grew. His voice, once commanding, had become soft and broken. But through it all, George kept asking one question: how did I not see this coming? The answer, his doctors explained, lay in decades of quiet neglect. Sodium doesn't scream. It doesn't sting. It doesn't make your stomach hurt. It just builds up, day after day, meal after meal, especially in older adults whose kidneys and arteries are no longer what they used to be. George had unknowingly trained his body to tolerate too much salt. Canned soups, frozen pizzas, lunch meats, they all seemed harmless, but combined, they formed a dangerous storm. Research published in the Journal of the American Medical Association found that adults consuming more than 500 milligrams of sodium daily had nearly double the risk of stroke, especially if they were over 60. George had been averaging close to 4,000 milligrams for years. That fact haunted him. He began journaling from his hospital bed notes for his grandkids, tips for friends, regrets he couldn't shake. I wish someone had grabbed me by the shoulders and told me the truth, he wrote. But maybe that person needs to be me now. And so, George made a promise when he got out. He would tell everyone who would listen at church, at the grocery store, even strangers at the park, that salt, not sugar, nearly killed him. And that no one should wait until it's too late to start reading labels. George was eventually discharged from the rehab center, though not fully recovered. He walked with a cane now. His right hand had limited mobility, but what he'd lost in physical strength, he gained in awareness and purpose. The first thing he and Linda did when they got home was open their pantry. They took every can, box, and frozen package off the shelves and started reading labels out loud. Linda gasped. One box of frozen lasagna had over 400 milligrams of sodium per serving. A single serving of ramen, nearly 1,800 milligrams. Even a can of healthy vegetable soup, over 900 milligrams per cup. Their kitchen became a crime scene. Products they trusted for decades, brands they grew up with, had silently betrayed them. They made a vow: no more shortcuts, no more blindly trusting packaging. From now on, they'd eat whole foods, fresh produce, lean proteins, healthy fats. George bought a label magnifier. Linda started cooking from scratch again, using herbs instead of salt. Meals became slower but more meaningful. The transformation spread beyond their household. George's story made the rounds at his local church. Friends began asking questions. Some even followed his lead and purged their own kitchens. One neighbor, a 62-year-old man with borderline high blood pressure, said, "I didn't realize I was gambling with my life every time I nuked a frozen dinner." George started writing articles for the local senior center newsletter. Salt is the new sugar, he titled one. Another was called The Silent Killer in Aisle 7. He wasn't trying to be dramatic. He was trying to save lives. And people listened because George wasn't some health nut or celebrity doctor. He was a guy just like them, someone who thought he was doing okay, until he wasn't. And when he looked them in the eye and said, "A can of soup almost ended me," they believed him. One Sunday after church, George stood up during coffee hour and shared his story in front of 24 fellow seniors. He didn't speak with drama or bitterness, just quiet truth. "I thought I was doing everything right." He told them, "I walked every day. I didn't drink. I didn't smoke, but I didn't read the labels." The room fell silent. That afternoon, something shifted. A couple approached George and asked for a list of low-sodium foods. Another man admitted he had no idea his low-fat frozen dinners were packed with salt. George realized he wasn't just healing, he was helping. The community started inviting him to speak at the senior center, the public library, even a local high school health class. He didn't use slides or medical jargon, just his story, a few product labels, and one powerful line. "This stroke didn't come out of nowhere. I helped build it, bite by bite." Dr. Raymond Kelly, a cardiologist from Ohio State Medical Center, later confirmed what George had experienced. For adults over 60, sodium sensitivity increases sharply. Even 1 or 2 high-sodium meals can trigger acute events in predisposed individuals. It's not just about long-term risk. It's about immediate danger. George began advocating for clearer food labeling. He wrote to his congressman. He signed petitions. He even spoke with a grocery store manager about creating a low-sodium aisle. "I'm not trying to scare people," he explained. "I'm trying to wake them up." Because that's what the stroke did for him. It woke him up. He now cooked with olive oil, fresh garlic, lemon juice, and herbs. His blood pressure stabilized. His energy returned. And though the stroke had left scars, he still couldn't fully grip a pen. His purpose gave him more power than he'd ever known. He used to fear being a burden. Now, he feared people staying asleep, sleepwalking into the same trap he had barely escaped. And every time someone told him, "I checked my pantry because of you," he knew he was doing the work that mattered most. George's story began spreading beyond his town. A local journalist picked it up and published a piece titled "The Man Who Took on Salt and Lived to Warn the Rest of Us." The article went viral. Soon, George was invited to speak on a regional health podcast, where he shared his journey with thousands of listeners across the Midwest. But one of the most powerful moments came when he was contacted by a young woman named Rachel from Texas. Her father, 62, a truck driver, had just suffered a minor stroke. Rachel had read George's story online and, after checking her parents' pantry, found over a dozen high-sodium products they used daily. "Your story made me cry," she wrote, "but it also made me change." That message stayed with George. He realized that every time he spoke up, every time he told the truth, he was creating a ripple effect. Not just in Ohio, not just in men his age beside, but across states, generations, and families. In response, George decided to team up with a local nutritionist to create a free handout titled 10 Everyday Foods That Could Raise Your Blood Pressure Without You Knowing. They distributed it at pharmacies, clinics, and senior homes. The list included things most people never question: canned beans, breakfast cereals, salad dressings, even some healthy protein bars. The more George learned, the more frustrated he became. Why weren't people being warned about this? Why weren't sodium levels displayed like sugar or fat? Why were food companies allowed to call something heart healthy when it contained nearly an entire day's worth of sodium? He wasn't angry, he was energized. "This isn't about fear," he told a reporter. "It's about empowerment. I want people to know what's in their food, to take control before their body forces them to." By now, George had become more than a stroke survivor. He was an advocate, an educator, a spark that lit fires in people he'd never even met. And with every life his story touched, he grew stronger, not in muscle, but in mission. He couldn't change the past, but he could make sure others had a better future. As George's influence grew, something unexpected happened. His own doctors began to change. Dr. Patel, his primary care physician, had treated George for years and always assumed his blood pressure was under control. But after seeing George's transformation and reading the research he brought in, Dr. Patel started reevaluating his approach to older patients. He reduced his reliance on medication as the first line of defense and began focusing more on diet education. George reminded me that we can't medicate our way out of a lifestyle problem, Dr. Patel admitted during a community health panel. George wasn't just changing neighbors, he was reshaping how professionals thought about prevention. Meanwhile, George and Linda took their mission even further. They began hosting small cooking classes at their home every Saturday morning. They called it Flavor Without Fear. Attendees learned how to make delicious meals without relying on salt, using garlic, citrus, fresh herbs, and healthy oils. Retired couples, widowers, even young parents started showing up. The kitchen, once a place of silent danger, had become a sanctuary of healing. One Saturday, a 72-year-old man named Leonard attended the class. He had been living alone since his wife passed and mostly ate microwave dinners. After trying Linda's low-sodium lentil stew, he broke down in tears. "I didn't know food could taste this good without salt," he whispered. It was a moment George would never forget. Through these classes, they built a community, one that extended far beyond food. People began swapping recipes, sharing victories, and supporting each other through health challenges. Some lost weight, others reduced their medication, but all of them gained something money couldn't buy: hope. George often ended each class with the same words: "You don't need to wait for a stroke to change. You can start today, right now. One meal, one label, one bite at a time." He knew not everyone would listen, but if even one person avoided the hell he went through, it was worth it. And as he cleaned up the dishes each Saturday, he'd look around the kitchen and smile, not with regret, but with gratitude. Because the same room that almost killed him had now become the place where he helped save others. As weeks turned into months, George's message continued to gain traction, reaching people far beyond his small Ohio neighborhood. A health documentary filmmaker contacted him, asking to feature his story in a series called Hidden Killers in Everyday Foods. George hesitated at first. He didn't see himself as a hero, just a man who made a mistake and lived to warn others. But Linda encouraged him. "You're not doing this for attention," she said. "You're doing this so someone else doesn't end up in your shoes." So, the camera crew came. They filmed George cooking in his kitchen, speaking at community events, and flipping through his old medical records. The footage was raw, unfiltered, and real. George didn't sugarcoat anything. He showed the scar on his neck from the feeding tube. He spoke about the depression that hit after the stroke. And he talked about hope, how small changes saved his life. The episode aired nationwide and struck a chord with millions. Viewers flooded the show's inbox with messages like, "I never thought to check sodium before. Now, I can't stop checking. George made me realize my pantry is a time bomb. My father had a stroke last year. I wish I'd seen this sooner." The impact was undeniable. George's journey became a symbol, not of fear, but of redemption, of taking control, of waking up before it's too late. But George wasn't done yet. He began lobbying local officials for better food labeling laws. He partnered with a chain of grocery stores to add visual salt alerts on high-sodium products. He even consulted with school districts to help them revise cafeteria menus for older staff and faculty. His story became a movement, and through it all, he never stopped showing up Saturday mornings in his kitchen, weeknights at town halls, and quiet afternoons writing letters to strangers who needed encouragement. George understood something powerful. Change doesn't happen from the top down. It starts with one person, one decision, one story. And thanks to him, that story was being told louder than ever before. Despite the growing recognition and impact of his work, George remained deeply grounded. He still wore the same flannel shirts, still drove his rusty old pickup, and still spent evenings on the porch with Linda, sipping chamomile tea and watching the sunset. Fame wasn't what fueled him. It was the letters, the phone calls, the trembling hands of strangers who hugged him at grocery stores and said, "You saved my husband," or "You made me rethink everything I put on my plate." One afternoon, George received a call from a man named Tom in Kansas. Tom had recently turned 60 and was diagnosed with hypertension. He'd stumbled upon George's story through the documentary and was stunned. "I thought eating canned soup and turkey sandwiches was healthy," he said. "I had no idea I was slowly poisoning myself." George didn't lecture him. He just listened. Then he offered to mail Tom his personal list of favorite low-sodium swaps brands he trusted, snacks he loved, even a simple homemade spice mix Linda created that mimicked salt's flavor using garlic powder, lemon zest, and dried herbs. A week later, Tom wrote back, "My wife and I cleaned out our pantry together. We even found a new favorite recipe, your lentil chili. Thank you for giving us a second chance." It was moments like this that reminded George why he kept going. He began collecting these letters and printing them out, storing them in a weathered shoebox marked evidence of change. Whenever doubt crept in, when fatigue hit, or when he questioned whether any of this really mattered, he'd open the box and read a few lines. Every sentence was a spark. Every story, a reason. At the end of each letter, George always replied with the same closing words, "You're not alone. You never were. And now, you never will be." Because that's what his journey had taught him. That health wasn't just about food or numbers on a chart. It was about connection, about being seen, being heard, and being reminded that even the smallest decision, reading a label, skipping a frozen dinner, could ripple out and change a life. He didn't need a stage to make a difference. He just needed one more person willing to listen. And day by day, letter by letter, meal by meal, that's exactly what he found. George was invited to speak at a national health conference in Denver. At first, he hesitated. It felt like too big of a stage for a retired mechanic from Ohio. But Linda placed her hand on his and said, "You've earned this, George. People need to hear your voice." When he took the stage, the audience was filled with doctors, policymakers, nutritionists, and wellness advocates. George walked slowly to the podium, cane in hand, and paused before speaking. "I'm not a scientist," he began. "I'm not a doctor. I'm just a man who didn't read labels until it almost killed me." The room grew still. He shared his journey, the stroke, the silent danger of sodium, the small changes that saved his life. But more than that, he spoke about responsibility, not just personal, but collective. Why are we waiting until people collapse in hospital beds to talk about this? He asked. Why not empower them before the damage is done? He urged healthcare professionals to speak in plain language. He challenged food companies to be honest in their packaging. He asked legislators to fight for transparency, not in small print, but in bold truth. By the time he stepped off the stage, people were on their feet. Articles about his speech spread across health blogs and news outlets. Some called him the reluctant revolutionary. Others, America's saltiest truth teller. George laughed at the nicknames, but he knew they weren't about him. They were about the message. Back in Ohio, his phone rang constantly. Colleges wanted him to speak. Grocery stores invited him to help design heart-safe sections. Even a major food brand reached out to ask if he'd consult on reformulating some of their products. George agreed, but only on one condition. We tell the truth. No half measures, no health washing, just real, honest food. The stroke had taken much from him, his strength, his voice, his independence. But it had also given him something few people ever find a mission worth living for. And now, that mission had a microphone. George's life, once predictable and quiet, had become something entirely different. But amid the travel, the interviews, and the growing spotlight, he always made time for the one thing that started it all: his community. Every Tuesday afternoon, George still met with a small group of seniors at the local library for what they called the Label Reading Club. They'd bring grocery store receipts, packaging from their pantries, and share what they'd found. George would guide them through hidden sodium sources, tricky serving sizes, and misleading health claims. It wasn't glamorous, but it was powerful. One day, a woman named Carol brought in a box of crackers labeled Heart Healthy. Together, they read the label: 310 milligrams of sodium per serving, and the box held 6 servings. Most people ate the whole box in one sitting. "That's nearly 2,000 milligrams of sodium," George exclaimed. Carol looked stunned. "I thought I was being good," she whispered. "That's the problem," George said. "You were trying, and they took advantage of that." It wasn't just about awareness, it was about justice. George realized that behind every confusing label and health-washed product was a company that bet people wouldn't dig deeper. So he made it his mission to teach them how. Not with anger, but with tools. Not by fear-mongering, but by empowering. The group began attracting more members: nurses, caregivers, even high school students doing health projects. George welcomed them all. He believed education wasn't about age, it was about urgency. "You don't have to be perfect," he often told them. "You just have to be curious and consistent." The library eventually dedicated a section to nutrition literacy, filled with books, brochures, and laminated guides created by George and his team. Kids would stop by with their grandparents and start asking questions. The ripple kept growing. George saw change not as a wave to be ridden, but as a seed to be planted again and again. In every conversation, every class, every quiet Tuesday afternoon, because he knew something most people missed. Revolution doesn't always look like fire and noise. Sometimes it looks like a man with a cane, reading the fine print on a cracker box. As winter rolled into spring, George's body grew more fragile, but his spirit only strengthened. He began mentoring a younger man named Miguel, a 33-year-old former fast food worker who had recently lost his father to a stroke. Miguel had stumbled into one of George's Saturday classes by accident, but stayed because something clicked. "I never thought anyone cared about people like me," Miguel said. "You made me see that I matter." George took Miguel under his wing. He shared everything he'd learned: the science, the heartbreak, the activism. Miguel, in turn, brought fresh energy, digital skills, and a deep passion for helping working-class families navigate nutrition. Together, they launched a small YouTube channel called The Salt Truth, where they reviewed products, taught label reading tips, and shared stories from real people affected by sodium. Miguel handled the camera. George handled the truth. The channel didn't go viral. It didn't need to. What it did was build a tight-knit community, a lifeline for caregivers, stroke survivors, busy parents, and curious teenagers who wanted to understand what was really in their food. One day, a subscriber named Deshaun commented, "I work 2 jobs. I don't have time for fancy diets, but I watched your video about microwave meals, and now I read every label. You probably saved my life." George responded the way he always did, with humility and encouragement. "We're all learning together, one label at a time." He knew that legacy wasn't about numbers or fame. It was about impact. And impact came from connection, from honesty, from showing up even when it was hard. Miguel began taking over more of the work as George's energy waned. He became the voice of a new generation, young, driven, and aware. But at every turn, he credited George. "He didn't just teach me how to fight sodium," Miguel said in one video. "He taught me how to care." George watched proudly from his porch, blanket over his legs, laptop in hand, eyes fixed on the screen, not for attention, but for hope. Because he knew the mission would outlive him, and that was enough. One morning, George woke up feeling weaker than usual. Linda noticed it immediately. His movements were slower, his words softer. She helped him to his chair by the window, where he always sipped his tea and read the news. "Maybe we should call Dr. Patel," she suggested gently. George nodded, but there was no panic in his eyes, only peace. Over the next few days, his body continued to slow down. The doctors said it was his heart worn out but not broken. George wasn't in pain. He was simply tired. He spent those final days surrounded by the life he helped rebuild. Former students from the Label Reading Club came by to say goodbye. Carol brought homemade low-sodium muffins. Leonard held his hand and told him, "Because of you, I get to meet my grandson next month." Miguel visited every evening, updating George on their latest video and reading him comments from viewers. "You're still saving lives, George," he said, tears in his eyes. George smiled faintly and whispered, "Keep going." One evening, Linda found George asleep in his chair, a soft smile on his face, hands resting on a printed email from a viewer named Sarah. "I changed because of you. My son will grow up with better habits. Thank you for being the spark." He passed away peacefully that night, under the soft hum of the ceiling fan, in the home where his second life began. At his memorial, people from all walks of life gathered: nurses, stroke survivors, grocery clerks, teachers, parents. They didn't come to mourn a hero. They came to honor a man who dared to turn his pain into purpose. Miguel spoke last. George didn't just fight sodium. He fought silence. He fought misinformation. He fought the idea that ordinary people couldn't make extraordinary change. Then he lifted a small cracker box from the podium and held it up. No one reads these like George did. But now, because of him, we all do. The crowd nodded. Some cried. Others smiled through their tears. And just like that, a legacy became a movement. Months after George's passing, his legacy continued to ripple through lives in ways even he couldn't have imagined. Miguel kept the Salt Truth channel alive. But more than that, he expanded it. He introduced new segments, interviews with cardiologists, tours through grocery store aisles, recipe tutorials from caregivers, and even live Q&A sessions for people struggling with meal planning. But every video still started the same way, with George's voice, a short clip from one of his earlier talks, where he said, "You have the right to know what's in your food. Don't let anyone take that away from you." That one sentence became a rallying cry, inspired by George. Several high schools across the country began integrating nutrition literacy into their health curriculum. One school in Michigan named their new cafeteria Reading Corner George's Table, where students could scan food packages and learn how to decode labels. A bill proposed in part by legislators who had attended George's Denver speech passed in Congress, requiring clearer front-of-package sodium warnings on processed foods. It was dubbed the Hyman Act. Miguel visited George's grave the day the bill passed. He knelt down, placed a laminated copy of the law beside the headstone, and whispered, "You did it." He looked around and saw something he hadn't expected others had visited too. The gravestone was surrounded by notes, cracker boxes, soup cans, and handwritten thank you letters. Some were from as far away as Alaska and Puerto Rico, and in that quiet cemetery, Miguel finally understood. George wasn't just one man. He was the start of a conversation, one that now spanned states, generations, and dinner tables. Later that year, Miguel published a book titled Label by Label, The Story of George Hyman. It quickly became a national bestseller, but what mattered more than sales were the emails that poured in. This book made me cry, and then clean out my pantry. My son now reads every label. Thank you for showing him how. George saved me, too. The story hadn't ended with George's death. It had just found new voices to carry it forward. And for every label flipped, every soup can put back on the shelf, every conversation sparked at the dinner table, George was still there, changing the world. One decision at a time. If you've made it this far, then you already know this isn't just a story about sodium. It's about what happens when an ordinary man dares to question the status quo and changes thousands of lives in the process. George didn't have a PhD. He didn't run a clinic. He didn't wear a white coat. He had something more powerful: the courage to care. He showed us that change doesn't come from perfection. It comes from consistency, from paying attention, from asking hard questions and not being satisfied with easy answers. And now it's your turn. Go to your pantry. Pick up the first item you see. Turn it around. Read the label. Is what you're about to eat helping you or hurting you? Don't let another day go by without understanding what you're putting into your body. Don't wait for the stroke, the scare, the regret. Start today. Start with one label, then another, then show someone else how. Because George's story isn't over. It lives on in the choices we make, the conversations we have, the meals we share. So if this story moved you, share it. Comment below. Tell us what surprised you. Tell us what you're changing. Tell us what you've learned. And don't forget to subscribe. There's more to uncover, more truth to tell, and more lives to save. One decision at a time.